Have you ever heard whispers from the walls of the Ottoman palaces? Have you ever wondered what really happened behind the opulent veils, golden lattice, and silent gardens of the Topkapi Palace? We often speak of the Ottoman Empire in terms of sultans, empires, wars, and harems. Always the female harems, the stunning women in silk lounging by fountains, waiting for the sultan's call. But buried beneath those stories, almost erased from the pages of polite history, is a chilling tale. A story soaked not in perfume and rosewater, but in fear, pain, and control. It is the forgotten story of the male concubines, boys taken from their families, molded into servitude, trapped in silk instead of chains. They were not soldiers nor slaves in the fields. They were the Sultan's secret possessions. Many of them never made it past their adolescence. And for those who did, what they lived through was a psychological cage more brutal than any battlefield. So buckle and let's pull aside the velvet curtain and walk barefoot across the cold marble of a forgotten world. A world of manipulation, mutilation, and male silence. This is not a tale of romance. It is a tale of domination. And by the end of the story, you may never look at a golden palace the same way again. The Ottoman Empire was one of the longest-lasting and most formidable empires in world history. At its height, it stretched from the gates of Vienna to the deserts of Arabia. But while cannons roared on its borders and architects carved heaven into stone with their mosques, another quieter operation took place inside the palace. It began, as most things do in imperial history, with power. The sultans feared rebellion, particularly from their own families. To prevent the kind of internal warfare that had destroyed dynasties before them, they developed what came to be known as the Devshm System, collecting Christian boys from the Balkans, converting them to Islam, and training them as elite soldiers and administrators. The harem, in its literal sense, means a forbidden place. It was the private world of the Sultan, a symbol of divine power, Islamic virtue, and erotic control. While most associate it with hundreds of beautiful women trained to entertain, breed, and obey, the truth was far more complex and sinister. Boys, too, had their place in this architecture of desire. From the 16th century onward, the Ottoman Empire developed one of the most sophisticated systems of sexual and political control ever seen. At the apex of this system was the Sultan himself, God's shadow on earth, answerable to no one. Below him were layers of viziers, eunuchs, guards, and slaves. Within the seraglio, however, all power, sexual and political, flowed inwards, toward him. Women were brought in for alliance building, pleasure, or strategic breeding. Boys were brought in for beauty, music, dance, and a level of erotic submission so complete it dissolved their very identity. The male concubines were not simply servants or musicians. They were objects of fantasy, trained from childhood to serve the elite's appetites. Known as Cossacks, their bodies were made and remade into instruments of aesthetic ecstasy. They danced in silks. They sang in voices untouched by manhood. And above all, they remained silent. But how were they created? How did the empire turn free boys into faceless pleasure tools? The Ottoman Empire perfected the art of recruitment through coercion. While the infamous Devshm System, the forced conscription of Christian boys for military and bureaucratic service, is well documented, what is less discussed is how many of these boys never made it to the Janissary barracks. Some were too beautiful, too soft, too alluring in the eyes of the collectors. Imagine being 10 years old, taken from a mountain village where your only crime was having a symmetrical face or large, almond-shaped eyes. The soldiers came with authority and laws behind them. You weren't being kidnapped, they said. You were being chosen. But no mother wept with joy. They wept because they knew what choosing meant. These children were often between 8 and 12 years old when taken. Plucked from villages across the Balkans, Anatolia, Armenia, Georgia, or the Caucasus, they were promised a life of elevation. Their families, sometimes paid or coerced, were told their sons would serve the Sultan and rise to power. But some were diverted along a different path. If selected for their aesthetic value, grace, beauty, the potential to seduce, they were taken into secretive schools that prepared them for a different kind of service, the harem. The journey from village to palace was filled with terror. Some resisted and were beaten. Others starved themselves. But resistance was crushed. Identity was stripped. New names were given. Languages were replaced. The Ottoman court needed blank slates, bodies that could be bent without breaking. And so, the first horror was memory itself. It had to be erased. The most beautiful boys were separated out like prized livestock. They were bathed, circumcised, renamed, and dressed in fine linens. And then the training began. Some were educated in language, poetry, courtly etiquette, and Islamic law. They were made to memorize scripture, perfect their posture, and learn the art of silence. Every movement was trained to please. Every glance was calculated. Others were stripped more thoroughly of their identities, and more painfully through castration. Yes, even boys as young as 7 were made eunuchs. The operation was excruciating and deadly. Without modern medicine, infection was common, and many boys bled to death or died from sepsis in dank corners of the palace. For those who survived, their voices never deepened. Their beards never grew. They became trapped in a strange limbo between boyhood and manhood. Eunuchs were both revered and reviled. They held immense power as they grew older, often becoming the gatekeepers of the Sultan's harem and secrets. But make no mistake, their power was earned through pain. There is no polite way to speak of castration. It is the ultimate domination of one human over another, the literal removal of agency, masculinity, and future. In the Ottoman court, not all Cossacks were castrated, but those destined for the deepest service in the harem often were. The practice was brutal. Because Islamic law forbade the act within the empire, boys were typically castrated outside Ottoman borders, in Christian or African territories, and then brought in as eunuchs. The mortality rate for castration was horrifying. Over 70% died from infection, bleeding, or shock. No anesthesia, no sterile tools, no kindness. The ones who survived were marked forever. Their voices would remain high and sweet, their bodies would develop differently, and they would be incapable of reproducing. This was intentional. A concubine could never be allowed to breed with royal blood. He must serve, not threaten. But this mutilation did something deeper. It told the boy, your future is not yours. Your pleasure is irrelevant. Your body exists for others now. The next stage was refinement. The palace did not want rough edges. Boys were trained for years in music, dance, etiquette, and, most importantly, obedience. They learned to play instruments, to move like wind through silk, to mimic the grace of a gazelle. The ideal Cossack was neither child nor man, neither slave nor prince. He existed in a kind of erotic limbo. Palace records show that they were adorned with jewels, henna, eyeliner, and fine fabrics. They performed in festivals, palace feasts, and private audiences. To the outside observer, it may have looked beautiful. Boys dancing in rhythmic perfection under candlelight, cymbals ringing like silver laughter. But this wasn't art. This was performance bound to exploitation. Many of the boys were forced to endure not just objectification, but assault. The Sultan, his sons, or visiting dignitaries often demanded their services. Refusal was not an option. Within the empire's vast architecture of domination, the Cossacks became the most refined tools of pleasure. Their existence was measured not by what they wanted, but by how well they performed what others desired. Life in the palace could turn deadly in a moment. A misplaced glance, a whispered rumor, or a jealous rival could spell doom. For Cossacks, who were both treasured and despised, the line was especially thin. They were adored in public, lavished with gifts, and then discarded in private. Some sultans grew obsessed with their favorite boys, granting them rooms and riches. But love in the Ottoman palace was always conditional. Should a Cossack grow too bold, too proud, or too emotionally entangled, he could be banished or worse. Punishments ranged from beatings to silent strangulation with a silk cord. No blood could be spilled in the Sultan's presence, so executions were made clean, quiet, and final. Many boys disappeared without a trace, and so silence became their only shield. Speak nothing, want nothing, feel nothing. To the outsider, the inner court of the Topkapi Palace was a dreamland. It was filled with mosaic fountains, perfumed courtyards, and marble corridors. But beneath the shimmering surface was a web of power games, sexual politics, and psychological torment. The male concubines, especially those kept for the Sultan's personal enjoyment, lived a life of anticipation. Each day, they waited to be summoned or dismissed. No one outside their world could truly comprehend the tension of existing not as a person, but as a possession. You could be favored one week, given silks, music, and jewels, then ignored or discarded the next. You were not allowed to love. You were not allowed to speak freely. Your body belonged to the empire, and the Sultan, despite his power, was himself a prisoner of protocol. He could not be seen engaging in activities deemed inappropriate for a ruler. Yet it was an open secret that some sultans, like Murad IV or Ibrahim I, had male favorites. They called them Kosekler or Oglani, dancing boys and inner boys, and while historians debate the exact nature of these relationships, the court whispers tell a darker story. The boys were trained to dance provocatively in women's clothing. They wore makeup, bells on their ankles, and moved in ways meant to seduce, to entertain, to arouse. The lines between performance and abuse were not just blurred, they were erased. No one could question the Sultan's desires, and the boys could not say no. The story of male concubines in the Ottoman Empire was not only about submission. It was also about rivalry, jealousy, and silent execution. The Ottoman court was a place of intrigue, and everyone wanted power, even if that power came through the Sultan's bed. Some concubines, both male and female, tried to manipulate their way into influence. A favorite concubine could become a whisperer in the Sultan's ear, but that influence came at a steep cost. If a concubine was suspected of disloyalty or if they became too influential, they could be disappeared. The methods were as quiet as they were brutal. Some were drowned in the Bosphorus with stones tied to their ankles. Others were strangled with silken cords, an execution method reserved for the nobility and favored slaves, ironically designed to prevent bloodshed. No funeral, no gravestone, just a whisper in the palace halls. He offended the Sultan. Even the chief black eunuch, one of the most powerful men in the empire, lived in constant danger. He knew too much. He saw too much. He controlled the harem and the inner boys, but if the Sultan turned against him, his influence would vanish like morning mist. As European envoys began visiting the Ottoman Empire, they were both horrified and fascinated by the idea of male concubines. Rumors traveled across Europe about the effeminate dancers, the eunuchs who whispered in the Sultan's chambers, and the exotic rituals of the Ottoman court. European writers, often biased and sensationalist, painted the empire as a den of decadence. They spoke of boys being used for pleasure, of princes surrounded by eunuchs, of harems filled not just with women, but with silken-clad boys playing flutes and dancing under moonlight. But these tales were not entirely fiction. The empire, meanwhile, responded with silence. These matters were not to be discussed. The official histories made little to no mention of the boys behind the scenes. The male concubines became phantoms, present in the corridors of power, yet erased from the record. What does it say about a society when its victims are not even given the dignity of being remembered? By the 18th and 19th centuries, the practice of keeping male concubines and castrated eunuchs began to wane. Western influence, modernization, and the slow crumbling of imperial power shifted the inner workings of the court. But it didn't disappear overnight. Even into the late 1800s, eunuchs still guarded the harem. Some were survivors of a system that no longer made sense in a changing world. Others had risen to power and wealth, becoming landlords, patrons of art, and even military commanders. Yet most of their stories remain unwritten. Their memories, locked in the walls of palaces now turned into museums, are fading echoes. No monument stands for them. No history book tells their full truth. Because how do you memorialize silence? There are almost no first-person accounts from the Cossacks. They were illiterate, censored, or simply disappeared. Their names are missing from records. Their graves are mostly unmarked. Yet their legacy haunts Ottoman history. Their images appear in paintings, Their forms flicker in poems, and their suffering lingers in the whispered corners of archival footnotes. They were victims of an empire that made beauty into bondage and submission into spectacle. They never asked to dance, but we remember them now. In telling this story, we do not seek to shame a culture or condemn a civilization. Every empire, whether Ottoman, Roman, Chinese, or European, has its dark corridors. Every palace has rooms it hides, but by bringing those shadows into light, we understand history not as a clean timeline of events, but as a tangled forest of human choices. The male concubines of the Ottoman Empire were not just victims. They were human beings with minds and dreams and pain, and for centuries they were erased from memory. Their lives dismissed as court secrets, their suffering lost in silks and gold. But history does not belong to victors alone. It belongs to the unheard. If the story moved you, don't let it die here. Share it. Discuss it. Let history breathe again, not as golden glory, but as raw, unvarnished truth.